the big focus this morning continues to be the 9th BRICS Summit. The official welcome ceremony is taking place in Xiamen in China today. The ceremony of the BRICS Summit witnessed BRICS leaders coming together. They were welcomed by the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, and it was a huge photo opportunity as usual for the media, with the BRICS leaders shaking hands with one another in what can be termed as a show of strength and unity by the leaders. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the Brazilian President Michel Temer, South Africa's President Jacob Zuma and the Russian President Vladimir Putin are attending the summit. And joining me live on the broadcast to talk more about what's happening in Xiamen is my colleague Ramesh Ramachandran. In the studio with me is WION Senior Editor Surya Gangadharan. Ramesh, to you first. Proceedings may well have begun for the BRICS Summit of 5 different countries, but the focus, I suppose, continues to be that nuclear test by North Korea. That is obviously going to make its way into proceedings. The plenary session is, of course, starting, but at the summit itself. China obviously going to be miffed by the fact that North Korea in some ways has stolen its thunder.
In a sense, yes, North Korea can be expected to dominate this year's BRICS Summit here in Xiamen, just because of the impeccable timing, some call it, of Kim Jong-un to test the 6th nuclear bomb, as it were, on the very day the BRICS leaders assembled here in Xiamen. And it happened just barely hours before the business forum began here in Xiamen. And that, to my mind, will set the tone or the pace of the deliberations here in Xiamen over the next 2 days, when the leaders of BRICS countries, namely Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, sit under one roof to thrash out a consensus on the way forward of diffusing or resolving the tensions on the North Korean peninsula. But just to give us a sense of what North Korea would like to say, or North Korea's take on this whole issue and discourse, North Korea calls it a purely defensive posture, and it says it is open for talks not with any country but only with the United States, anytime, anywhere, but without preconditions. And that, by the way, Aisha, is also the position, similar position of Moscow on this issue of North Korea. Remember, President Putin wrote a signed article on the eve of the BRICS Summit, in which he had to share a few words about his thoughts, or his take on the North Korean situation. And he said it in so many words that the threat of sanctions will not work, they are futile, and that dialogue is the only way forward, again, without preconditions. And that, to my mind, puts the ball firmly in the court of Washington. It's for the Trump administration now to take a call on how to take this forward.
And that is a difficult call, given the kind of different and parallel conversations we've been hearing from Washington, D.C. itself. But Ramesh, beyond North Korea, just to bring the focus back to BRICS and the 5 member countries, what, in your opinion, is going to be the defining characteristic of this year's conversation, and what might make its way into the declaration at the end of the Xiamen Summit?
Right, so I'll answer your question in 2 parts. One, about the BRICS as a whole. Remember, we are entering a new decade, the 2nd decade of BRICS existence, and all 5 countries are looking forward to set the agenda, as it were, for the remaining or the next 10 years. The first summit was held way back in 2009, and in 2011 we saw the addition or inclusion of South Africa as the 5th BRICS member country. By the way, BRICS was first conceptualized way back in 2001, so it's been 17 long years for the BRICS to come into its own. And some would say BRICS in ideal's time has come, and it is here to stay. Now, the only challenge for the BRICS member countries is to rejuvenate the organization, the grouping, to revitalize and to reinvent themselves for the 2nd decade of their existence. That's as far as the BRICS is concerned. Remember, BRICS accounts for about 23% of global GDP and about 40% of the global population. But more interestingly, Aisha, from India's perspective, it is India and China who are called the engines of global growth. And it is these 2 countries that are holding up the BRICS, or the global economy, as it were. So the responsibility is equally on both India and China to come to some sort of an understanding on issues such as free trade, globalization, investments, and including investment opportunities in infrastructure development, such as under the ambit of the new development bank, which was started under the aegis of the BRICS member countries. That's as far as BRICS goes. From India's perspective, Aisha, India, Prime Minister Modi would be looking forward to reiterate once again India's position on cross-border terrorism, especially that emanating from India's immediate neighborhood. That said, other issues such as trade, investments, economic growth, development, especially economic connectivity in the light of CPEC, for instance, or OBOR. Now, India maintains that economic connectivity is fine, it is welcome, India welcomes it, but not at the expense of its own sovereignty or territorial integrity.
All right. Stay with me, Ramesh. I want to just introduce our viewers to our other guests who are joining us this morning to talk more about BRICS, multilateral groupings and unilateral actions such as North Korea's. On the show with me this morning in the studio itself is WION Senior Editor Surya Gangadharan. Also joining us on the broadcast is Professor Stephen Golub. He is an international affairs expert joining in from the United States. Good morning, gentlemen. Professor Golub, if I can come across to you first. You know, these multilateral groupings like BRICS, like G20, like SAARC, they look great on paper. But when unilateral action like what North Korea has displayed just yesterday takes place, does it take away from the significance in the 21st century of multilateral groupings such as the ones that are underway in Xiamen today?
Oh, I don't think so at all. I think multilateral groupings and conversations, agreements are tremendously important regardless of what's going on with North Korea. North Korea and its nuclear weapons are a very important and in some ways unique issue. Whether BRICS itself can really deal with it, play a major role with it as an organization or as a grouping of countries is another matter, but that by no means forecloses the many, many important roles that multilateral organizations can play regarding economic, strategic, environmental, and other issues.
Okay, so Surya, if we're to talk about how multilateral groupings like BRICS can deal with rogue nations, as the United States has called North Korea, how does it go about happening? Who do countries like the US rely on to bring into check, let's say, activity that is considered worrisome for the rest of the world?
I think we've seen that rogue nations don't exist on their own. You know, they always have some support from some part of the world. And if you look at China and North Korea, they've had a long and deep relationship. And China says even today that it does not want war on the peninsula. It wants the US to talk to the North Koreans. It wants, Russia has also proposed some kind of a mechanism where the US and South Korea end their exercises and the North will stop testing missiles and nuclear weapons. So all these, North Korea is not existing in a vacuum, you know, they are being supported from somewhere. And at BRICS, obviously, some of these issues will play out. I don't expect that BRICS is going to actually sit there and try and decide how to resolve this issue. I think it's not within its ambit, frankly. But yes, it will be discussed, it will be talked about, ideas will be shared. India has come out with a fairly strong warning about North Korea's conduct. And in that sense, India may be a little out of sync with the rest of BRICS members, you know. China and Russia do have stakes in the current North Korean regime. What they're saying is not incorrect, that there should be talks between the US and North Korea. But that's not going to happen, at least not now.
Okay. The geopolitical shifts that are taking place, Professor Golub, ensure also in some ways that the North's demand for talks with Washington, D.C. might just remain a demand for a while longer.
It's these two sides are at loggerheads in a game that's getting increasingly dangerous and threatening. Washington doesn't want, wants North Korea to step back in some ways before it can have talks. North Korea wants unconditional talks. As you said, it just wants to talk to the U.S., whereas there are obviously nations that have vital stakes at play here, not least South Korea. So I hope that they'll get past this point and be willing to have some constructive dialogue. But right now, it just doesn't look very promising.
Absolutely. Ramesh, to come back to the BRICS itself, I mean, North Korea, of course, figuring prominently in our conversation this morning. But, all right, we'll connect with Ramesh in just a second. As soon as we get him back, we'll continue that conversation. But, Professor Golub, I can take that question across to you. We're talking about 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, convening in China for the 9th BRICS Summit. If I can ask you, beyond what's happening in, let's say, in terms of the relationship between the United States and North Korea, what exactly do you see as the role of a multilateral grouping such as BRICS in today's day and age, given that these are emerging global forces that want to make their appearance stronger and stronger on the global front? What exactly is the significance of a grouping like BRICS in today's day and age?
That's a good question. We'll see. In some ways, it's a collection of very significant players on the international stage, but what they have in common, how much they can influence it as a group as opposed to individually, and obviously all of these countries to some extent can influence matters individually in their regions and in the world. What they can do as a group remains to be seen. If I could throw one idea out there, which I haven't read about, although perhaps I've just missed it in the initial discussions of this meeting, is that one big role these nations can play as a group would be regarding climate change and environmental matters. I don't have to tell you folks about the horrible floods you've been experiencing in your region. We've had it here. We've got record heat right now in California. And while you can't attribute any specific incident to climate change, we are seeing more and more of this, and these types of events will be more and more likely going forward. Whether this meeting focuses on environmental matters, I don't know, but these countries, because they are so influential and significant regarding environmental matters and policy, I think could come together in some very constructive ways going forward.
Okay, also on the broadcast with us right now is Petr Topichkanov. He's a senior researcher and associate at the Carnegie Moscow Center. Good morning, Petr. Thanks for joining us here on WION. Professor Golub mentioned climate change. Do you think it's going to figure prominently in discussions at BRICS, or are events of a different nature going to take center stage when these 5 countries begin to talk?
I'm not sure that this can be a central part of the debates between the BRICS Club Summit, because it's not in the tradition of this club to discuss the issues around the BRICS, around the climate change. And in previous meetings, these nations didn't play a bigger role and bigger attention to the climate and environmental issues. It's strange to be fact, because I agree and I totally share the idea that to ignore climate change and environmental changes, we will lose more and more money in the budgets. And especially it's important because the key focus of the BRICS Summit is and in previous summits, the key focus was, of course, about economy and trade and relations between these countries. So it would be logical to pay more attention, but it's unfortunately in the tradition of this club to miss this point in the agenda of the BRICS Summit.
All right, Surya, so traditionally speaking, climate change, environment issues haven't necessarily made their way into the focal points of BRICS summits in the past. Also, I mean, this grouping was formed on the idea of emerging economies and the emphasis, but that's really changed over the last couple of years. We've seen, more talk about regional security, regional cooperation in terms of defending countries against attacks that are terrorist in nature, and perhaps that indicates what's going to happen this time around as well, that economy yes, protectionism yes, but the conversation perhaps will remain limited to talking about regional security among other things.
I think BRICS is a good platform to discuss regional security issues. I'm not sure exactly to exchange ideas, I'm not sure exactly if there can be much of a consensus because, as we're aware, when you look at China and Russia, they're pulling in a certain direction when it comes to our own region, you know, with respect to Pakistan, Afghanistan, talking to the Taliban.
Right.
India is pulling in another direction. So it's a good platform to exchange ideas. I'm not very sure how much of a consensus can actually emerge, given that we have very, very different perceptions of how this issue should be managed.
Absolutely.
And that could be a little bit of a question mark. On the other hand, when I look at it, renewable energy and cooperation in climate change, these are win-win areas for everyone. You know, we all have a stake in it. And no matter what President Trump may say, the fact is China and India are committed to cooperating on climate change. And we have a positive program ahead. I think this is a win-win for both of us, for all of us actually.
All right, Professor Golub, I'm just going to read out to you something that I read earlier this morning, that some of the critique that is directed towards the BRICS grouping, for instance, is that the member countries have very little in common. They don't have a lot of common ground, and that they face various economic challenges. And putting that, making that a bit more specific, let's talk about India and China, for instance. The fact is that the two countries have just ended a protracted standoff at Doklam. There was mention of the fact that India might even choose to not attend the BRICS Summit, and that perhaps might have been the linchpin in bringing the two parties to the same table, ensuring that the BRICS Summit goes ahead. When two big countries like India and China are, carrying out this standoff on one end, and yet come together on the BRICS Summit as equal partners on equal footing, does that sort of complicate things further when we're looking at multilateral groupings such as these?
Well, I think as was just very correctly pointed out, there are many respects in which these countries don't have the same perspectives or the same priorities or simply don't agree, and getting cooperation on all such issues may not be possible. Nevertheless, it's still very important for countries to talk to each other. Sometimes just the personal rapport that could be established between world leaders can be important in dealing with issues or problems that come up down the line. So while I fully agree with the point that we can't expect BRICS to take all the countries to take a common stand on that many issues, it still can be important for them to get together and meet and discuss their differences as well as areas of agreement. And that is one reason why I mentioned the whole matter of the environment and climate change. They certainly have different perspectives on that, but India and China are moving ahead in some very good ways in challenging that. I wish I could say the same for my own country, but that's another matter.
Absolutely. I think there's no denying that climate change and the fact that South Asia is dealing with all these with floods and so many deaths, it only becomes sort of important to talk about, and it seems only obvious that it should come up, but perhaps it will, perhaps it won't. We'll have to wait for the session to get underway to get to know more of what's being talked about. But Peter, if I can come to you next, what exactly does Russia look to when it comes to BRICS? What are its hopes from this grouping, given Russia's growing importance, of course, for countries like China and India? It's always been an important partner for India. But when it comes specifically to BRICS, what is Russia looking for?
I would say that in the beginning and in many years, the main interest of Russia was about the dialogue with China, India, South Africa, Brazil, about mostly economy and international economic order. It was the main interest. But when the Crimean annexation happened from the Russian side, Russia started thinking about using different formats about political dialogue, and even more, in that time, Russia made attempts to bring political agenda to the BRICS Summit, and also try to establish more concrete and permanent organs inside the BRICS structure, without any previous experience of this club to have permanent structures. So from this point of view, it was a Russian initiative to establish some kind of office or permanent parliamentarian dialogue of the BRICS. And for me, it was, again, a surprise. First, because there was no consensus inside Russia about the need to have permanent organs for this organization, because many people, including myself, we understand the value of having very loose connected but very free informal dialogue of this organization. But at the same time, it was very clear that it was one of the key and important agenda for Russia to have political dialogue, to have some kind of political consensus of the BRICS members. Just maybe it was important to avoid political isolation after the Crimean annexation, and for Russia it was a good platform to demonstrate that Russia is not alone, and Russia has other nations supporting it and its policy. But what was interesting, yes, Russia didn't receive such a big support about creating permanent organs of the BRICS club. Even our very close strategic partner, India, very clearly said that no, it's not a good idea to have permanent organs inside this organization, and let it be something it was in years before. Very free dialogue, non-informal dialogue between member states.
Okay, so it may have started off, Surya, as an economic grouping, but as Petter's pointing out, politics was, or bringing in political dialogue was important for Russia, and I suppose for India too. I mean, even this time around, China's raised a red flag about talking about Pakistan, talking about terrorism, but that is something that India has brought up before, and it will be something that India brings up this time around as well, because terrorism, as long as terrorism is around, you can't really talk about growing economy.
Absolutely. I think good politics is good economics and vice versa. And when you have a grouping like this sitting together who are all actively involved in this part of the world, yes, terrorism is a major issue. And you can't deny that India is a victim of terrorism. Russia is involved in this region in ways in which we are not very comfortable. China has a strong relationship with Pakistan. They are overlooking various acts of omission and commission by Pakistan. They are defending Pakistan in international fora, even blocking sanctioning of terrorists. That's not something we can live with. And that's one of the reasons why when you look at a platform like BRICS, it's great to talk and it's great to exchange ideas, and it's a good place to build a rapport with leaders. But at the same time, at the end of the day, you have to look at your own national interests and where that is pushing you. And that's where I think the sense one gets from BRICS is that these are countries pulling in different directions.
Right.
And India certainly, yes. I think China and Russia too.
Absolutely. Professor Golub, looking at what Surya just put on the table for us, there are internal contradictions. The fact that, China has the National People's Congress coming up shortly. India is focusing on its next general election in 2019. All these countries are facing their own domestic issues. We don't even need to talk about Brazil's economy and Jacob Zuma surviving one more no confidence motion. So just looking at the various sort of pressures and pulls within each of these countries, does BRICS then, as you're mentioning, you said that talking is important, it also then becomes an important distraction in many ways from the very different domestic issues that these countries are facing, and brings the focus back on the way forward for the BRICS in its 9th or 10th year. In fact, it's going to be the start of a new decade next year.
Well, I don't know if it's quite a distraction. The reason I've been harping a bit on the environmental or climate change issue is not to say that that will be a focus of discussion now. That's not the orientation of the leaders necessarily, but just that if BRICS wanted to be more than the sum of its parts, if it wanted to be something going forward, that could be an area of potential cooperation in staking out some common policy positions, and those leaders are certainly going to experience it very possibly in Xiamen, given how horrible it's a wonderful city. I've been there, fascinating culturally, wonderful people, but the air quality there, rivals some of the worst in the world. So they're going to be experiencing environmental issues firsthand. I guess to get back to your broader question, I don't want to, at the same time that I want to emphasize, I think these meetings can be valuable for all sorts of reasons. I also want to echo what I think you've just heard, not to overstate the importance of this. It is good that these leaders are getting together, but they are going to go all their own way in terms of different priorities and in terms of internal issues they all have to deal with, internal politics and policy differences they have to deal with.
All right, so we're going to have to leave it at that for now, gentlemen. But thank you all for bringing your perspectives to the table. Peter Topichkanov, Professor Stephen Golub, my colleague Surya Gangadharan and Ramesh Ramachandran as well, for joining us on the broadcast this morning. I think we've been able to touch upon some interesting contradictions that form an integral part of summits such as BRICS.